Next up, we are going to take a break from learning about common programming statements and dive into what happens when the code we write doesn't work. More specifically, we will be covering the different types of errors that can occur when you are programming and what causes them. Now, when you are writing code, you have to understand that things aren't always going to go the way you expect them. Sometimes the program doesn't always work as you had intended it to. We programmers call these errors, and while annoying, they are always going to come up in computer science, and so it's best to learn what they are and how to deal with them. Often referred to as bugs, errors in scripting languages can be narrowed down to one of three types: syntax, runtime, and logic, all three of which we will be covering in today's lecture. To kick things off, let's talk about syntax errors. These are usually the easiest of the three to solve, since they are oftentimes something that can be fixed within seconds. If you remember back to earlier the video when we talked about syntax and programming rules, we said that if you were to break the programming rules or syntax, that it would result in an error. Well, that's what syntax errors are: parts in your program where you fail to meet the programming rules, and so the computer doesn't know how to interpret your code. This can be anything from forgetting a semicolon at the end of a statement in Java, accidentally defining a variable with two words instead of one, or even misspelling the word string when you are trying to define a string variable. Luckily for you guys, these errors are extremely easy to fix, since you just need to figure out where the error occurred and what the syntax rule you broke was. Now, thinking back to IDEs, we mentioned that IDEs are so useful because they do precisely that. They underline syntax errors and usually provide helpful hints as how to fix them. Think of syntax errors as small misspellings or grammatical errors in an essay you are writing. Annoying, yes, but not the most frustrating. Another useful thing about IDEs when it comes to syntax errors is that the program will actually restrict you from running the code unless all syntax errors are cleared. Making them even easier to identify and fix. The second type of error we will be covering is the runtime error. These errors don't show until you actually run the code, hence the name runtime error. Runtime errors are caused by a statement in your code that seems logically okay, but the computer physically has no way of computing it into a reasonable amount of time. The most common of these errors is one which we have already talked about, the infinite loop. As a refresher or example, think of an infinity loop like this. Say you set your friend down in front of the TV, put on Office on repeat, and told him he could leave as soon as Michael made a "that's what she said" joke. Seems pretty simple, right? Wrong, because instead of putting in the Office, you put in Friends on Blu-ray. No Michael, no inappropriate joke, meaning your friend would be sitting there for the rest of his life, probably confused as to why Dunder Mifflin looks so much like a coffee shop. This is essentially what happens with the computer. You give it some condition that it has to complete before the program can terminate. However, you give it no feasible way to finish that task. This puts the computer in error mode and most likely will crash your program as the computer desperately tries to complete the condition you gave it. As a computer example, if we try to have a program terminate when an integer is no longer greater than 99, but I is initially 100 and only increases, the loop will never terminate and the program will crash. To avoid this, you generally want to think through the flow of your code before running it, especially with loops, to make sure that all of your statements can be completed by the computer. Carefully planning out your code before you begin writing it is an extremely useful practice, and something we will be covering towards the later part of this video. The final type of error that we will be covering is a logic error. This error is pretty self-explanatory. Logic error occurs when the code runs smoothly without any runtime or syntax errors, but the result that you get isn't what you wanted. For example, let's say you had a calculator app and you want to instruct the program to add two numbers, except it multiplied them instead because you used the multiplication symbol on accident. This leads the sum to be 36 instead of 13. Nothing went wrong with the code syntax or runtime wise, the code runs just fine. It just doesn't work as you intended it to. These are often the hardest types of errors to debug, since most of the time you will have no idea why the code isn't working, and certainly not any idea of how to fix it. This is why it's a good idea to test your code incrementally. Don't wait until you've been programming for an hour before testing your application, or else you will run into a lot of logic errors. Logic errors can be extremely frustrating and could cost you a lot of time, making them a huge pain. But if you know how to effectively debug your code, you will be just fine.